I'll be speaking to Dr. Alice Rothchild, a medical doctor who specializes in OBGYN, who upon her retirement was assistant professor of obstetrics and gynecology at Harvard Medical School. She's also been active for many years on the questions of Palestine and Israel. And out of that concern became a filmmaker and a writer of adult and then children's books. She had an outstanding opinion piece in the New York Times in January, and we're going to start the interview talking about it. Good morning. You're still in morning over there.
Yep, still morning on the West Coast.
Okay. On January 9th, the Times published your opinion piece that was headlined, "For Gaza's Pregnant Women and Newborns, the War Will Never Be Over." You start by talking about a dentist named Aya, I'm going to say Haris. You can correct my pronunciation.
We're all butchering the Arabic at this point, yes.
Yes. So tell about what you said in the article about her.
So I was able to interview her on WhatsApp. Interviewing people in Gaza is very difficult because of the lack of internet and electricity. But every now and then you can get through. And so she is a dentist in her 20s. She has a 2-year-old child. Her husband is a doctor. And she was pregnant when the war started, and she has diabetes. So what she recounted was an inability to get doctor's appointments. She lost contact with all of her healthcare providers. She was living in the north in Gaza City. And so she had no monitoring of her pregnancy, of her diabetes. And in addition, she couldn't get insulin. So her husband was getting various things to substitute for insulin that are not optimal, but she also couldn't get the lab test to know, is she on the right dose and what's going on? So it was basically a high-risk pregnancy, completely unmonitored in the context of a war. And so over the course of the pregnancy, she was 32 weeks when I talked with her. They had moved 5 times. And so they were living in the South. I got the impression that her husband was working in a hospital in the South and she was with family somewhere. They were not together a lot because sometimes he would answer, sometimes she would answer, depending on who had connectivity. And she had been able to see a doctor in the South who said that she had excessive amniotic fluid and should have the baby promptly by C-section, but there were no hospitals able to provide that. And so she had a C-section potentially booked in January, and then was able to get another C-section that also happened in January. And so she did have the baby then.
I see. Yeah, I think things are just beyond belief. Someone we work with in Gaza City, he had to deliver the baby himself. All he had was advice from a doctor over a phone.
Right.
And
well, women who are in labor will risk their lives leaving their shelter or their homes or wherever they're at to get to a hospital. When they get to a hospital, they're competing with all the people who are injured and have their legs blown off and all that kind of stuff. So they don't have enough staff to attend to the women. And there have been reports of women having C-sections without anesthesia. Women are often sent home 3 hours after having the baby because they need the bed or they need wherever they have delivered. And, if they're going home to a family home with 40 other people or an UNRWA shelter where there are 500 people using one bathroom, or in this case, to a tent, which is where she's currently living, this is not optimal conditions for a vulnerable mother and her newborn. And as you can imagine, besides just keeping them both warm, there's a huge problem with food and food insecurity. Massive amount of hunger and famine are reaching the levels of starvation. And doesn't take an obstetrician to figure out that if you're dehydrated from all the polluted water and the lack of water, and you're hungry and you're malnourished, that you're not going to be able to breastfeed well. And so, women are struggling over breastfeeding. Then they turn to formula, so they have to acquire the formula, which is a powder, which is expensive. And then they have to mix it with water, which is usually polluted and full of E. coli from the overflowing sewage systems that are no longer treated. So it's just a sort of accumulation of travesties. And then the babies, don't get adequate pediatric care. So, postpartum depression, issues around breastfeeding, issues around neonatal health are all going to be enormous. And there are about 185 women delivering every day under suboptimal conditions.
Yeah, really horrendous. Now, you've kind of answered some of this already, but you say the war will never be over for pregnant women and newborns in Gaza. What do you mean by that exactly?
Well, first of all, the women are traumatized like the entire population. I mean, having to flee on foot, pregnant multiple times, and living in horrendous, unhygienic conditions is a recipe for a lifetime of trauma. We know that those kind of conditions increase the risk of congenital abnormalities. There's been a 300% increase in miscarriages. There's going to be more stillbirths, more preterm labor, and more pregnancy complications that are not treated, like hypertension or hemorrhage. So women are at risk for being very ill and for dying when they're delivering. Those who survive this whole crisis have a baby that is at risk for developmental issues, sensory motor issues due to malnutrition, due to trauma. And so it just goes on and on. There are a lot of studies not coming out of Gaza because the data hasn't been collected yet, but of other war-torn places that document that kids have developmental issues, and then further on into adulthood, major medical issues related to this kind of situation. So that's what I mean by a lifetime of recovering from this kind of situation.
And your article was published before the U.S. suspended payments to UNRWA, right, and all these other countries did the same, and they can run out of money at the end of the month. And I can't imagine what that would mean.
Well, I think, first of all, we have to remember that UNRWA was severely underfunded before the war. So they're now underfunded. And even their ability to get aid is severely limited by what the Israeli military is allowing. And even when aid gets in there, it's very hard to deliver it because the roads are all shot up and bulldozed and God knows what. So the amount of aid that's actually getting to people is pitifully small, and it's much, much worse in the north. The thing I find really interesting about the Israeli government's accusation that there were 12 UNRWA employees who participated in the Hamas attack is that what I have read is that these accusations were obtained by people who were in prison and were being potentially tortured by the Israeli prison people, which is what happens in Israeli jails. So we don't even know how accurate these accusations are. The Israeli government has not released credible information. But even if it were true, which would be horrifying because UN employees take a pledge of being neutral, and the vast majority of them do. We have 12 people who are accused, 2 who are dead, and 13,000 employees in Gaza. Now, if the Israeli military committed some heinous human rights violation, which I would like to add they do all the time, no one is talking about not sending Israel another $10 billion for their military. So this is a kind of excuse to punish UNRWA, which the Israeli government has been wanting to destroy for a long time now, and which many analysts think is a punishment for the behavior and the adjudication in the International Court of Justice. So it's a heavily politicized moment, but whatever did happen, it does not justify not defunding an agency that is basically keeping people alive in a very bare way and providing shelter and medicine.
And of course, it's no coincidence that the attack on UNRWA and its reputation came out the very day that the International Court of Justice that came out with its rather severe opinion against
Right.
Israel.
Right.
And as you mentioned, if Israel committed, I mean, it killed at least 130 UNRWA workers,
Right.
who presumably were all innocent. Now, you explain in that New York Times piece that the infant death rate was quite bad before this war began, and that the mortality rates were 7 times that of Israel. That's pretty awful.
Yeah, well, the Israeli government has had a policy of what's called de-development of the healthcare system. So since the siege and even before with the blockade, they have severely limited medications, equipment, critical medications, oxygen, the things that you need to have to run a hospital. They have severely limited the ability of staff to leave the strip and get more advanced training. And they have limited the ability to bring in advanced equipment, to build bigger facilities. I mean, all the things that are required to have a viable healthcare system. And there are 2 medical schools. There's tons of doctors, there's tons of nurses, but there's not places for them to work. And so this is part of an Israeli policy of really squeezing and crushing the healthcare system, which then is reflected in morbidity statistics and mortality statistics. And then on top of that, you put a huge level of unemployment. It was about 50% before the war, and a huge amount of poverty. And people who are poor and unable to feed themselves adequately are going to be sick. So it's that kind of environment.
Imagine a word, de-development. I mean, George Orwell could have put it in the
It was actually coined
1984.
by Dr. Sarah Roy, who's an expert on Hamas at Harvard University.
Oh, she mentioned it. It
She
wasn't
made up
Israeli.
the word, or she
Yeah.
coined the word.
I think she had deindustrialization. She invented that even earlier. Pretty bad.
And I should mention that I was in Gaza in August, so right before this all happened.
Mm.
So I have a very, and it was my 4th time in Gaza, a very personal gut level feeling about what Gaza was like before the war.
So are you able to make an overall comment about how the hospitals are functioning? From
Yes.
what I can tell from just journalistic reports, most are shut down and the rest are barely functioning. Is that right?
So there has been what appears to be a deliberate attack on hospitals by the Israeli military, which is against international law. I mean, if hospitals have patients in them, you're not allowed to bomb them. And stop. So they have destroyed 2/3 of the hospitals in Gaza, and the 1/3 that are partially functional, the key word here is partially. Many of them don't have fuel. The fuel is used to run electrical generators. Many of them are severely short on medicines, on blood products, on staff, because staff have been killed. Staff have had to flee to the south. Some of them are sort of, limping along, but they're surrounded by tanks and fighting, and no one can get to the hospital. So if you're in the hospital, you might be able to get treatment, although there's not enough stuff to treat you. And if you need the hospital, you can't get there. So that's going on as well. So it's a very crippled healthcare system with an incredibly heroic, devoted healthcare staff. I mean, the doctors and nurses and people working in the hospital are just incredible heroes and working endless hours, not having enough food, treating people on the floor, when they run out of beds. The ability to clean the wards is very low because there's not water, there's not stuff to sanitize. I mean, it's just catastrophic. And it speaks to this sort of slow genocidal process. So many Palestinians I know say, well, I have 2 choices. I can die quickly from a bomb, or I can die slowly, and I'll die slowly because I can't get health care. Or, I mean, there's now analysts who are saying that more people are going to die from infectious disease than died from bombing. So this is where Gazans are at.
Yeah. And then the hospitals are a place of residence because people
Right.
see them safe, and every square inch has got people in it.
Yeah. thousands and thousands of people are sheltering in hospitals. And so when the hospitals get evacuated, you have thousands of people fleeing who thought they would be safe, plus their family members who were hospitalized, plus various people who were just staying there to avoid dying.
Wow. So what's been the reaction to your piece in the Times?
Well, I haven't read the comments in the New York Times because I generally don't like to do that. But there are a whole bunch of people who contacted me personally. Most of them were thanking me, grateful, all that kind of response. And then a few of them called me a capo and a Jew who hates Jews and a self-hating Jew and all the usual trash that people say, which that's nothing new for me. And so I've got the usual mixed response, but mostly positive. But again, if people hate what you say, they usually don't feel compelled to write you a personal email.
There's, this has been in the news for months, especially what's happening to hospitals. So what are organizations, medical organizations in the US saying, whether it's doctors or worker unions or associations?
So I actually wrote an op-ed about this that was published in the Seattle Times. So the thing that really devastates me is that the vast majority of medical professional organizations are saying nothing or saying, Israel has a right to defend itself. So I am stunned that, for instance, the American College of OBGYN does not, people, and these are groups that comment on war in Ukraine and other, it's not that they never make political comments, but not on this one. So, I'm stunned that the American College of OBGYN does not want to raise its voice on the impact on pregnancy and childbirth. I mean, or the pediatric organization that, the 2/3 of the people killed are women and children. There's been like incredible silence. The only US organization that I've been able to find that's made a public statement is the American Public Health Association. There is a group called Health Workers for Palestine that is organizing health workers because a lot of people that are not, head of professional organizations are horrified. And so they're organizing strikes and protests and statements and that kind of thing.
Well, we need lots more of that. Well, I want to thank you for this. Before we end, I'd like to tell viewers that they can find more about Alice Rothchild's work at alicerothchild.com. And I understand you have some other websites.
Yeah. So I did do a documentary film, which traces the history of Palestine from the eyes of Palestinians who lived the events. And that's currently available on Vimeo as well as on the website voicesacrossthedivide.com. And I have developed an interest in writing books for children because I'm looking for how do I get beyond the choir. And one of the things that I noticed was that there are almost no credible books on Palestine for kids. So I have written a young adult novel called Finding Melody Sullivan that came out last year. And I'm launching tomorrow a middle grade novel called Old Enough to Know. And so the website for those books is alicerothchildbooks.com. And I think the current catastrophe that's going on and the need to have a more literate and culturally responsive population has to start with kids. And they have to be able to see Palestinian refugees like they see Somali refugees or Ukrainian refugees or whatever refugee population. And they need to understand settler colonialism, whether it's the US or Australia or Israel, we need to just have that be part of the conversation. So this is my contribution to children's literature, hopefully to change minds in kids and to challenge what they hear around them and to help them grow to be better citizens and to be more respectful of people who are different than them, or if they are Arab or Palestinian, to finally see themselves reflected in children's literature and teen literature.
Well, thank you so much for the interview.
Thank you.